Thanks very much for, I was going to say thanks very much for coming back after lunch. That's good. I have to say that as students, but it's good to see the room still has the requisite number of people. And I know quite a few people are joining us from Zoom as well, so that's fantastic. We're in the third session now. We've got 3 papers in this session. Then we'll have a break and go through our final 3 papers, which include people from England and from Europe, which is fantastic. So my paper on the challenges of data in Australian economic history. As I'm chairing this session, I'm only going to take 2 hours to present today, and then we leave a few minutes for everyone else. No, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to stick to my 20 minutes plus 10 with my questions. This particular paper relates to journal article or a paper that's actually been developed by myself and Cate Pattison, my colleague in the West Australian Economic History Research Network. And Cate and I have been working on this, I guess, from a number of perspectives, but the network's purpose is to really try and raise the acknowledgement of West Australian and Australian economic history and regional economic history for that matter, as well as to drive the interest in young scholars coming into the field to be able to support those scholars in terms of pursuing things like masters and PhDs and so on, looking at local history and the local context of history in terms of how Western Australian economy might articulate nationally into the Commonwealth and internationally into the broader region. And so this series of papers that we have for the WA Economic History Summit each year is all part of that strategy to try and raise the profile. The other issue that's related to this, though, is in the context of actual data and being able to get access to data. And I guess there's fundamentally 3 things that we found when we spoke to prospective PhD students and others that might have an interest in WA history. There was the first and very difficult issue to overcome, and that is that Western Australian history, generally speaking, is not considered at a higher level, if you like, in terms of international economic history. Although, funnily enough, perhaps that's part of the tall poppy syndrome from an Australian perspective, but I've certainly had great audiences in Britain and in America and others around the world that are interested in our history, perhaps more than we are. And that relates to economic history as well. But I guess in terms of this particular paper, what I wanted to speak to is the challenges obviously related to data in that context of economic history. And the second and third elements that were important when we spoke to prospective PhD students and scholars was both whether or not economic data actually exists. And this is, I guess, a point that is being worked through as we go, but also where that economic data does exist, whether it is, I guess to put it bluntly, as conveniently accessible and workable as that data we might find at a national level or in other sources. In other words, one of the things that we heard from prospective students was the overhead, if you like, of having to create data or identify data to search for it in the context of the methods that you need to undertake in Western Australian terms, obviated against them taking a topic that was relevant to the state as opposed to looking at data that was much more freely available and much more not only available but actually able to be manipulated and used. So in a format that was able to be manipulated. So this particular discussion today, the 20 minutes that I have, is really to look at this story of economic history data and some of the things that we are looking to try and champion in relation to that. I guess the other thing that I'd say is a prefatory remark in that regard is that we have, as you know, Joan Roses from the LSE and also Jane Humphreys from Oxford speaking later on. And we've had to record their sessions because it's very early in the morning in Britain, as I'm sure you're aware, unfortunately. And just as a bit of a side note, we might try and take this session or have this summit in October next year so that we actually meet the UK's summer times and have these people live. But I don't want to step on their toes in terms of what they're presenting on, which is broadly looking at economic history and the prospects for economic history. So some of the things that are presenting difficulties and some of the things that might be positive outcomes going forward. And I too want to talk to that history, or that economic data, but I want to talk to a degree positively as well, because I think there's a number of things that are happening, not least of which we've an increasing number of scholars and proto-scholars working through elements in terms of WA economic history, but also I think the work Michael particularly has done in terms of bringing together the history and philosophy of social sciences network has been a really important set of infrastructure to bring together multidisciplinary approaches. And again, without presupposing Jones or Jane's comments later on today, one of the big things about economic history going forward is the multidisciplinary approach, the importance of that approach in terms of its survivorship. So in this particular 20 minutes, or now 15 minutes, I think I've got remaining, and I've got to be as disciplined as I've asked the other speakers to be. But I want to look at this idea of data and economic history from a WA perspective, I guess, and to say that economic histories, of course, are important. They're sources of narrative, explanation, but also prediction. And I think that's one of the key things that's quite exciting about quite a number of topics that are being explored now, where we're not just looking at what happened, we're actually looking at what happened in the context of what might happen going forward. And I think that's a really important issue. But we, of course, are dependent on the availability and the quality and quantity of data that's made available to those scholars to be able to do the work they need to do. The inflection of that, though, is not just on the amount of data and whether you can go and get that data, but ultimately, once you've gathered that data, whether you can manipulate it is a really important issue. And I think one of the most positive things that I want to touch base on in this presentation is the fact that we're increasingly seeing technological responses to that particular challenge, where we can scan documents, electrify those documents, and then we have the technology to start to manipulate those documents in the same way as if we had created an Excel spreadsheet or something like that. But there is a subsequent issue that comes with that, and you've seen my technological prowess on display today and how well I have been doing in that regard. I guess the other aspect is that probably in terms of being able to exploit the existence of this data, we need to see scholars that don't just have economics and an understanding of that economics background, don't just have that historiography or that understanding of the history background, but they also need to have their figures and able to be able to manipulate the data and understand that technology. And I think that's a big challenge coming forward. Perhaps it's a generational thing as well. I know that kids coming through are much more profoundly good at these things than I am, but I do think that's an important thing for us to consider in the context of this presentation. So I guess the other thing that is really important here, and again, I don't want to stand on Jones and Jane's toes, and you'll see when their presentations are run what I'm talking about, I hope, but there is also the fact that at the end of the day, the extant accessible and manipulable data also drives the topics that are being evaluated and considered by scholars. And I think that's a really important issue as well, because when you're seeing scholars start to produce work, other scholars coming through the ranks look to emulate that work or are guided by what that work says and what that work's about, it tends to result in a biasing or an over-researching in some areas and an under-researching in the others. And I think Western Australian economic history generally is a really good example of that outcome, where we see a need for a lot of work to be done to sort of bring Western Australian economic history up to the bar, the starting point, but perhaps at a national level or in other jurisdictions, there's already advancements. So the phenomenon, I think, is also likely to see that imbalance of emphasis in terms of findings. So not only what have we found in relation to these topics, but also what are those topics telling us about policy settings and practices going forward, not just in history. So in this paper that Cate and I are developing, really we're looking to undertake, I guess, effectively a literature review to a fair degree, but to be exploring how the use of statistics has evolved over time in terms of historiography, considering the impact of that data available, so what kinds of impacts have the data had on the themes that are being explored, the emphasis, points of emphasis being made and so on. In other words, those comments I've just made, the extent to which they're fulfilled in the literature itself. To be able to map the literature on data use is really important as well. And I guess out of all of this, trying to both present the challenges and the opportunities inherent in WA economic history investigation, but also perhaps also to provide a safety net or support for those scholars coming on that might have an interest in this area, and I guess to support them in being able to find that data and to use that data. So it's going to be a paper that's all things to all people, obviously, which is why we're still developing, but I rather suspect. The historians in the room of econometrics and cliometrics may find fault with this very, very simple table, but I guess just trying to give a little bit of a background or a bit of a run through on what we see as the major steps in terms of the development of economic history, starting in 1926 with the launch of the Economic History Review, which I think is the same year that the Royal West Australian Historical Society launched their journal as well, early days. And so I think that's probably part of this greater milieu of increasing interest in history and matters of an economic history as well. And you can see at the University of London, the creation of that journal obviously drove a big and important interest in this area. Cliometrics, obviously in the 1950s, became a very important element as well, combining that statistical analysis and economic theory to be able to understand what was going on and what might go on as a result of analysing that history. And then, of course, with the 1970s broader economic quantification revolution, where we see, or where it seems in the literature, that there was a conflation of this historiography, this history view, but with a broader economics view, the growth of economics and developing that. Certainly economic history seems to have been dragged along or pushed along in the context of that particular development. Now that has two impacts, one which I've already spoken about, which is what themes and what things are actually investigated become important, but then subsequently the growth and the change in that economic history and its description became very important. As we get to the 1990s, of course, the amount of data that's accessible becomes much more significant, not just because data is being created increasingly in modern terms, but also because, as I said before, the technology for access to that data has been a really important element to being able to use that data for your evaluations. So in this article, we look to apply essentially three heads, if you like, where we're approaching the literature to try and determine what the outcomes have been up to this point in time, and perhaps make some prescriptions about how things might go further. Essentially what we're saying is that there are three clear elements that are really important, but probably from a pure history perspective, the cliometrics is the third that is most important. On the other hand, we're looking at archiving and digitisation of those archives. A big issue here in Western Australia, as I'm sure many of you are aware, with the State Records Office not really having the wherewithal, the resources to be able to pursue that. And I guess one of our aims is to try and cajole, advocate for better records management in terms of digitisation of those records going forward. And then, of course, data accessibility is absolutely critical there. And by accessibility, I mean not just being able to get hold of the data, but also being able to manipulate that data, as I said before. So what about cliometrics and the quantitative history? I think there's a few things that are important to say here, and I want to say though up front that this is really a very high level run through, of course, and there are things I'm sure that strike people in the room that need to be taken into consideration. But having said that, there's no doubt that in the Australian context, the pioneering work of people like Noel Butlin and others, we're all well aware of the work that they undertook, of the books that were written and the seminal and important analysis that they undertook. Having looked at the tools they had to be able to undertake that level of analysis, I'm not sure that I would be able to get through that in the time that we're expected to be able to present articles these days. But nevertheless, obviously that was absolutely critical. Critical for bringing that data to light, critical for bringing the topics to light that have been subsequently reviewed, but also critical on the international stage, and particularly with Butland presenting his results and his data against those results that were identified in America or in Latin America and in other places. So there's plenty of examples where he presented that Australian data and shed light on the growth of the Australian economy up to those times. I guess the others, though, that we think about or need to consider in that regard are not just pure economic data. So one of the great things about economic history and the data that's associated with that, of course, is that we don't just look at the financial, transactional or financial flows, the financial resources, but we look at all of the elements associated with the growth of the economy, including things like immigration and so on. And so there are a number of resources that explore this, including Kelly, as you can see there, 1965, looking at migration to Australia in the 19th century. But then scholars also looking at some of the historiographical questions rather, relating to things like or topics such as the role of women, Aboriginal people and so on, are all part of that economic history. And I guess that comes back to my comments earlier in relation to Michael's contribution particularly, but the joining of or the multidisciplinary approach to economic history and the explication of that. So not just looking at that economic outcome. I guess the other thing though that's important is that, and people like myself, and I think Andrew Pickford has written about this as well, where that historiography, that analysis has been conducted at a national level in Australia, but automatically and I guess logically to some degree focusing on very much on that Australian Felix, the southeastern corner of the Australian experience, as opposed to say Western Australia, perhaps Queensland, Northern Territory also miss out in terms of that narrative as well. So this element, I think, says to me, number one, that there is a long history of undertaking these kinds of examinations in our history. There is an established history, but also an established set of themes, an established set of discussions that go with that, but also that it shows up or identifies quite clearly some of the gaps in the West Australian economic history that we need to be thinking about in terms of filling in what that grand trajectory of economic development has been in WA and what some of the causes of that might or might not have been, and what the outcomes of that might be going forward as well. So I guess there's a position we're taking is that economics is the primary sphere of quantitative history because it does provide that measurable ability to measurably assess what's going on. The character of the indicators, even when we talk demographics and otherwise, are economics in nature rather than some other field. I think that's a really important thing to be thinking about in the context of WA economic history, particularly going forward. That quantitative data accessibility that I've spoken about a few times now is really significant, and that's changed the world in terms of the way we can use data, access data and manipulate data. The big problem is though that if the data that you're looking to access is either on microfiche at the SRO, or worse still, it's in a box on a warehouse floor out in Welshpool with the SRO, then that becomes very difficult for people to find new data and to be able to explore that data and add, if you like, the analysis to the story of Western Australian development. And so we see these things as being very positive, of course. There's no doubt these tools have made a big difference to our capacity to do the work that we want to do. But equally, I think there are some real challenges in that work in the sense of being able to say, at the end of the day, we need to digitise, put that data into a method or into a form that can actually be accessed. And we need to be able to get some resources for that, including public resources, I think is really important. This importance, I think, is emphasised by the pending 2029 celebrations or bicentenary that we've got coming up, and the ability of scholars to be able to access data and to use that data in that context, I think is really an important thing. So the archive digitisation of big history is also something that I think Joan and Jane will talk about a little bit later in our session. But for now, I wanted to just simply point out that in terms of modern economic history, I think big data is a really important resource that we're looking at. And I think that's where economics, as well as economic historians, economists and economic historians can come together to look at what's happened and what's going forward. So I think there's a real opportunity there within that big data story to be able to focus on those outcomes a little bit more. Perhaps in the context of Western Australia, that's talking about the trajectory of the economy rather than specific examples of economic growth or specific individuals. At the end of the day then, I think what we're also seeing is that a lot of the economic history dimension or elements that we're engaging with are also representative or relevant to things like exploring climate change, analysis of criminal justice statistics and other elements that are absolutely critical to modern public policy and effective public policy going forward. So to that extent, I think there's a real need there for us to consider Western Australian economic history, not just in the context of the economy, as I said before, but how socially, in terms of policy and otherwise, this data can help us to understand what's happened and perhaps more importantly understand what's going to happen into the future, how we can be predictive. I guess the other thing that we've identified in that regard is that since the early 2000s, as you can see here, the number of student numbers in economic history have obviously declined and academic posts in that area have declined as well. Now, I don't want to speak to that at all because I keep picking on poor Joan and Jane, but they will talk to this a little bit more from a global perspective. I guess from my personal experience though, one of the things that's been really heartening in terms of working with everyone to get things like this summit up and running has been that there is a phenomenal interest in West Australian history generally and West Australian economic history particularly. So I think there is an opportunity and a demand out there. We need to bring that to the fore and I think raise the profile of it more than anything perhaps. So the final thing that I want to say, and I think I've got about 1 minute left to say it in my 20 minutes designated or allocated, is that one of the things that we have been doing in the WA Economic History Network is to start to look at how we can assist in terms of the digitisation of this data, and then once it's digitised, how we might be able to disseminate this data, how scholars might be able to gain access to it. And to that extent, looking at the WA Blue Books has been a real revelation over the last 12 months or so in the context of this particular endeavour. The Blue Books, for those who aren't aware, is essentially the annual report that's written by the Governor of the colony, the Swan River Colony each year, called the Blue Books because guess what colour they are? It's blue. And essentially we sought to gain access to these books to be able to undertake some analysis of a number of things, some demographics and some other stuff that we were looking to do in relation to some WA history topics that weren't, that we were working on. And we changed tack to start looking at how we might digitise the Blue Books because we found that when we went to the libraries weren't sure whether they had the Blue Books, whether they'd thrown them out or even what they were. And so we thought immediately, I'm an accountant, so I'm very quick to take these kind of clues. Very quickly thought we need to do something to make sure that this is preserved, but not only that it's preserved, that scholars can get easy access to them. And so to that extent, we've been working hard to try and get all of the Blue Books on both microfilm versions as well as the hard copy versions that are extant, digitised so that they can then go onto the internet and people can access those and use them. The nice thing about that digitisation is that we also have the technology now, as I said before, to not only digitise that and the pages themselves, but to also pick up columns of data and other things out of those pages and convert them in order to be able to manipulate them, which I'm sure you'll agree is a fantastic advantage in terms of digitising those things. And so we've got a project in place where, as I say, where we're digitising the last range of Blue Books. We will have a complete set of Blue Books digitised and freely accessible. Certainly on our website, we would like to make that available on the SRO's website as well for obvious reasons, but hopefully them and Trove will pick that up as well. And we're really were pleased because the WA History Foundation also gave us a grant to be able to support this particular project, which is fantastic. So I wanted to just give you a bit of a case study of something that is actually quite tangible and I think fundamental to any history of Western Australia, not just an economic history, that we understand what those colonial governors thought, what they were doing, what decisions they made, what challenges they had. And if you like, the annual report, the annual blue book, I think is a fantastic starting point for anyone that has an interest in any period of history in Western Australia, not just from an economic perspective. And so having, at the end of this project, hopefully by March next year, the entire range of blue books on a digital copy and available through at least our website, if not through one of the government institutions, I think is a real step forward there. And that, I think, encapsulates what we're trying to do in terms of the network and part of the work, I think, that's not just the undertaking of history, but how do we facilitate future generations to undertake that history and build the institutions that we need to build to do that. That's all I wanted to present on. I'd be delighted to take any questions or comments.
As a personal interest, how accessible are the blue books now, Dave?
Then they're on the microfiche at the SRO, so you have to go to the state.
No, I was thinking of the online version.
We're still scanning those, so it takes quite some time because you basically got to scan it page by page.
So we'll have to wait till March till then.
I think so, yes. Yeah, I think so, because we've got a web page to build and other things that we have to do to be able to facilitate that. Having said that, you know, people are interested in it. We don't own the copyright. We're not wanting to own it. So if you sent me your email and said, David, as soon as we can get access, we'd like to get access, I'm sure we could make that happen. In the mail? Yep. All right. If people still deliver that, I'll respond accordingly. No problem. Michael?
Just a comment, you know, the Cliometrics and Cliometric history being driven by economic story of telling, they're moving to big history, driving on big data. I guess the theme that comes out of that is that it will displace economics from the centre of that story, economic theory at least from the centre of that story, because most use of big history is looked by a wide range of people, famous people, just everywhere. It's the method, to understand the method. You can use big history and how you have to understand economic theory first. So I guess that's a consequence of that sequence that you are.
It's a really good point, Michael, and I initially was going to speak to that, but I'll keep blaming, hopefully Joan and Jane deliver this afternoon, because there's a lot of stuff that I'm putting in their basket, which they can't do asleep at the moment, so they're hopefully sleeping sweetly. But you're quite right. I think that is a challenge that's been brought up as well, that a lack of understanding of that economic theory leads to a few things. One, which we discussed just the other day, undertaking economic history analysis without thinking about whether or not the theory was actually correct in the end, and what implications that historiography has for the theory as well. So I think that's really important. I guess from my perspective and our perspective in terms of what can the network do, my view is it's the highest priority is to raise the profile of WA history and WA economic history and get the data to be able to then meet the need if that profile, if we're successful in what we're doing. But I think you're absolutely correct. Malcolm, and then we'll go to Hamish. I think you've got your hand up.
David, I agree with you that the data is very important, or access to the data is very important to raise the profile of Western Australian history. But what I would suggest that one way we can also do that is by undertaking more comparative studies. And I'm thinking similarities between, say, WA and economies elsewhere is an area worth exploring. And the immediate country that comes to mind is Canada, which has similar natural resource-based exploitation history and so forth. And I assume a relatively good set of data sources as well. And so perhaps one way of raising the profile is more comparative work, which can bring out contrasts and similarities between societies in different countries that have undergone development. And that will help raise the profile of West Australian history.
I think that's a really good point. In fact, Andrew is smiling there. He and I are putting together an edited volume looking at capital formation in the settler colonies. and not purely for the reasons that I've been talking about, but certainly we hope they feed into that. And what's been interesting, and Andrew might have a comment as well, but making the connections between historians around the world has been quite a rewarding process. Because a lot of historians in their own jurisdictions feel a little bit the same way as we might feel in WA, if that makes sense. But I think that's a really prescient comment.
Yeah, I just say that the trend is, again, the trend is for the shrinkage of it, but having worked in Canadian universities, there is interest, and I think it's one avenue to achieve that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Hamish, I think you had your hand up.
I did, and this follows on from the previous comment. So it's a comment on the previous comment. One of the great things about the Blue Books is that they used a standardised form all across the British Empire. And so there's now an emphasis on every Australian colony stroke state digitising the Blue Books, and also, of course, getting the Canadian provinces to do exactly the same. But the question that I have is, in Tasmania, there are two files which represent the workings out of the Blue Books. They're called CSO 50 and CSO 49. And you have all of the rough draft material in those. Do such things exist in WA as well?
They do. They're variously located in London or in some in the SRO and some around the traps. To be honest, we haven't spent a lot of time looking at those. I guess getting the principal volumes digitised has been the highest priority. But there is a phenomenal amount of subsidiary data and work that needs to be digitised along with it. So my suggestion is that would be the case, that data would exist, I'm sure.
It's my recollection from reading Batty and Crowley and various other early histories that they did make extensive use of Blue Books, but obviously not at the level that you're espousing with computers, etc.
Yes, certainly looked at all those data in the Blue Books. So I guess my principal concern was the opportunity for the Blue Books to be lost to history, firstly, and then secondly to be accessed. But of course, all of that analysis was done manually, and so being able to replicate the analysis or be able to use that to support other scholars, I think, is an important element.
There's hardly any stats, of course, in Batty.
Yeah. That is much more discursive.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much for that opportunity. Oh, sorry. And a question. Is that right, Pam?
No, just a comment that we use the Blue Book stats as the basis for the WA section of the Bicentennial Historical Statistics book.
Yes.
And that was, Noel did that in order to encourage the comparisons that Malcolm Tull was just talking about, but they haven't really eventuated.
No, I think that's true. Thank you, everybody. Let's go on now to the next paper, because I think I'm just on time. So I'm just going to set that up and allow you, Hamish, to be able to share your screen. Can you have a go at that?
Have a look at that. Is that working now?
That looks good, yes.
And I'm just going to play slideshow now. So hopefully it just come up. And just tell me if the slide transitioned.
That transitioned well, yeah.
Fantastic. So this is a neat follow-on. I'm going to talk about crime data largely, and the potential for doing something I think really, really interesting in WA. And I thought I would start by emphasizing the extent to which people in the past have been fascinated and overwhelmed by criminal justice data. So this is a Bertillon cabinet invented by Alphonse Bertillon in the 19th century as a kind of like early way of identifying criminals based on their physical attributes. So the idea was that you could identify somebody's ear shape and some other attribute of them, and you would press those bits of the cabinet, and out would pop all of the suspects who had physical features that match that kind of profile. And effectively, what we have been doing in Tasmania over a number of years now is building our version of a battalion cabinet using, well, starting from convict records, but then integrating that with all kinds of other classes of information. And to cut to the chase with this, if there was any place where you were going to do this, it would make sense for it to be Western Australia. And why? Well, here are some transportation numbers over time. Here we have the size of the British hulk population. So the hulks were the depots in which male convicts were housed prior to being transported. Here we have the rise in British penitentiary inmates at the end of the transportation era. And here is the period of transportation to Western Australia. So if we were ever going to answer that question posed by Jeremy Bentham, was the panopticon better than transportation to New South Wales? In fact, we'd have to change New South Wales to Western Australia, because the only point where we have comparable data is that window. But there are other reasons for embarking on this kind of a reconstitution of the archive. Intergenerational transmission is a particularly gnarly question. And Australia is well placed to make inroads here precisely because such great data, such great individual level data was formed for every one of the 170,000 men, women and children that were transported to Australia. And the kind of questions that I think we should be concentrating on are things like increased prosecution risk. So if one or more of your parents has a conviction history, your conviction history, the probability that you will be convicted goes through the roof. There are a number of explanations for this. There's the Herald Sun explanation, which is poor parenting. Certainly we've got evidence for poor parenting. We also have evidence for genetic risk, and particularly through things like schizophrenia. But shared environmental experience, we know, has a lot of evidence behind it that if parents and child are brought up in the same crimogenic environment, it may be the environment and nothing to do with the household, which is transmitting prosecution risk. And then finally, there's a well-known relationship between the police doing their job and increased prosecution. So, of course, the police have a list of the usual suspects, and if your parents or other family members are on that, the chances that they will come knocking on your door are dramatically increased. Now, this is not actually the primary issue which interests me. I'm much more interested in the intergenerational transmission of inequality. But it turns out that these two issues require very, very similar data sets to explore. So again, that we know that there's a genetic factor in intergenerational transmission of poor or good health, and we also know that there's an environmental factor. But now, for example, we know that the mother's literacy is highly correlated in the past with life expectancy. But since the 1990s, we've also known that, that life expectancy is in part a product of what's called the fetal origins hypothesis, the idea that we're genetically programmed to expect the conditions that our grandmothers and mothers encountered. And when that doesn't happen, when we're born into a land of, let's say, comparative plenty compared to their experience, then the risk of type 2 diabetes and heart attack increases. And I think this is a particular interest in studies of 19th and early 20th century Australia, since we have a lot of evidence that living conditions were better than in the old world. And then we have also evidence for gene-environment interactions, so chemical coating of chromosomes. Now, just to emphasize that there is no way that we can unpick any of these very, very complex issues without digitizing our archival records. In order to get stuck into these, we need at least 3 generations worth of data, if not 5. And there's no way that these can be done by, for example, using a clinical trial, because everybody will be long dead before you get the results of the trial. So for the last 15 years or so, we've been trying to join together a whole heap of teams or projects that use Tasmanian data, particularly convict data, in order to assemble digitized versions of those records, clean them, code them, and link them together. And we've managed to do that for all of the major classes of records, for convicts, and increasingly for assisted migrants. But then we backlink those into British, Irish, and other empire-wide institutions which those convicts came from, and included data for people who are not transported. And we've also managed to link forward into birth, death, and marriage records, burial records, pauper and hospital records, police gazettes, valuation rolls, departures, bank account holders. And then finally, we have the records for the First World War. 15,500 Tasmanians volunteered for service. And what's interesting about these is that they were also weighed and measured and underwent very similar physical examinations to the convicts that arrived 3 and 4 generations beforehand. Now, in putting all of this together, we've realized that there are some huge advantages to trying to digitize complete count records. So for example, if you have all registered births, and we have a complete set of birth certificates in Tasmania that have all been digitized and cleaned from 1838 to 99, if you were to line these up against Catholic baptisms, then you'll see a gap between the two. Many Catholics didn't register the birth of their children. They thought that registering with the church was sufficient, and so that they didn't complete the civil registration process. And of course, by lining the two record groups up, you start to see that kind of a gap. And indeed, we can go further. We can look at a suburb, a street, a household, and of course, an individual family, nesting each record series within its larger parent. And so one way of looking at this is that as you're constructing these different record series and keeping them alive and accessible together as a collection, you're starting to create something we might call the frame of the nation. I'm just going to very, very quickly take you through one page of our database. This is just the basic landing page with details of individual convicts on it. And just look at some of the things that we've managed to do. So we have both an original police number, so this is a 19th century identifier, and the current archival identifier for each individual. We have every variant spelling that we have found. So this massively helps with record linkage, particularly important for women. So we have maiden names and married names, but we also have all aliases that we know for an individual. We've also developed coding systems for ship arrivals, very important for record linkage. We have, I'm just going to have to move everybody's pictures. We have hypertext links to images of the original records in the archive. So if anybody has any doubt about our transcription, they can see the original. And that kind of link to that turns out to be very, very important and relatively easy to manage. We also have place of birth. Took a long time to do this, but convicts were asked to give their place of birth down to parish level. And so we've geocoded their birthplaces. And so, for example, we can do things like do heat maps of tall and shorter than average convicts by place of birth in the UK. And so this provides an indication of how the centres of the industrialisation also produce shorter than average convicts. We also have very detailed literacy data, detailed in terms of the 19th century, and we have age data. And again, we can mash these two together. So these are the ages of reported ages of all female convicts on arrival in Van Diemen's Land. And this is their average literacy scores. So you can see plunges in scores for women who report their ages as 30, 40, and 50. So clear relationship between reported age and reported literacy. This is a way of actually checking to see whether the volunteered literacy data is consistent, and our check suggests that it is. And we have detailed information about occupation, which we've also coded in various different ways. Now, to provide an illustration of one individual life and the kind of things that you can do with it, this is actually a Canadian convict, a man called André Cassavant, who signed a probation, in the probation era, in the 1840s, he signed a passholder contract with a man called Theophilus Lightfoot. We are in the process of giving every convict employer their own unique ID. We have located Theophilus Lightfoot's property. It's at a place called Denmark Hill, and given that an ID. We have also managed to create shapefiles for each county and each hundred and each parish, and indeed link properties in our data set to the current Tasmanian Heritage Register. This property is in the Heritage Register so that we can actually fix exactly where it is. We've also linked these records to runaway notices in the newspaper so that we know that André Cassavant tried to run away. We know also where he was recaptured. It was in Hobart because the magistrate who tried the case was resident in Hobart. And amazingly, we also know that it was 18.3 degrees C when he ran, and the wind was from the north and it was squally, because we have the daily weather temperature data in the newspaper. So we put all of that together. There's 6 series there with 281,000 observations in them. And you can use that to pull out an individual story, but you can also use it to pull out a big story. And here we have an absconding map of, so these are the locations that convicts ran away from across Van Diemen's Land over time. And you can click on any one of these and actually find every individual, and you can explore their history. But of course, this allows us to tell wider stories. So, for example, we're now able to look at the timing of punishments. So these are sentences to hard labor on the roads in Van Diemen's Land over time. So this is the proportion of male convicts that are undergoing hard labor on the roads. And you'll see that it oscillates. And when we fit over the top the costs of rationing a convict for each year, you can see that there's a very, very close correlation. And so we're doing some more testing on this, but what we think happens is when the costs of maintaining a convict in the private sector rise, masters try to use the magistrate's bench to shift those costs onto the state. And then we can also map the convict death record over the top of that. Convicts die at higher numbers when they're grouped together in government works compared to when they're spread out over the environment. We've also been able to, because of digitisation, for the first time, look at the weight of punishment that fell on convicts, and it's not trivial. We were staggered to see that there were nearly 20 million days served in hard labour by male and female convicts in Tasmania alone, and something like 800,000 days spent in solitary confinement. We've also done quite a lot of work measuring convict protests. So what we've taken as a measure of convict protest is when two or more convicts are charged for refusing to work or neglect of duty, or in some other way impeding, in the views of their masters or the administration, the pace of work. And in all, we have documented 11,000 cases. Now, this includes New South Wales as well. I was able to collaborate with Michael Quinlan, and involves something like 43,000 convicts. And so using this big data, we were able to reconstruct the collective protest rate amongst convicts as measured as every 1,000 convicts on strength. Now, the apology here is the one missing bit in the convict visualization is Western Australia. So this is going to need to be added. But you can see the Castle Hill Rebellion in 1804, and then this wave of convict protest in the 1820s and 30s. And we were able to put that into the context of strike action by non-unionized free workers and also unionized workers. And what's interesting here is that we've uncovered an industrial relations crisis in Australia, which was unknown before. And in fact, nothing happened on the scale of the 1820s and 30s until the pastoral and maritime strikes of the 1890s. Now, it takes a bit of time to do this, and large teams help, but we're also able to create algorithms which you can use to visualize any single convict life. Of course, this kind of work is very, very important if you want to try and calculate the impact that something like solitary confinement has on life expectancy. And I'm just going to move on to look at a new project that I have with Lionel, who I can see is online. So in this project, we're going to move beyond the convict era, but a lot of the data that we've assembled so far will be very, very useful in pushing this project forward to conclusion. Well, what we're going to do is to link the birth record for Tasmania to the valuation rolls that appeared in the paper. So the valuation rolls tell you the rateable value of every house, and critically, who is occupying it as well as who owns it. By linking births, by using the information on each informant to the valuation roll, we are able to put that birth into context. We know exactly the house that it's in, and we also know, or with a bit of GIS work, we can locate that house on street plans. So we know who the owner of the house is. We can place that house in the context of the valuation of all houses in that street. And we can also trace those individuals to death and see whether the value of the house or the local environment in which a child is born influences their life expectancy. And of course, again, we have the daily weather temperature data, which will be very, very useful in this form of analysis. Now, I'm just going to wind up by saying a few things about the lessons that we've learned in doing all of this. Playing at this kind of scale is actually relatively easy if you've got good relationships between a lot of different research teams. And we've got an advantage in Tasmania in that where it's a fairly small place, everybody knows each other. But getting coding systems, so the metadata that you import into data, you use to analyze data, getting those schemes to line up is very, very important. We use coding dictionaries, and we make those freely available. So if somebody else has a whole heap of records taken from conduct records, for example, we'll give them our coding dictionaries. And that means that when they code up their data, we know that they've done it in exactly the same way as we've done it. So they could add new coding columns, but we know that these two data sets will now talk to each other. And indeed, you can go on adding data sets here, knowing that they will talk to each other. And I actually wonder whether an extension of this could become like to use a perhaps crude analogy, an academic form of Tinder, so that you would know when somebody had matched to your data set. You could get a message saying somebody else has used your coding dictionary in order to code up their data. Now, last couple of slides. I've been very conscious that in pulling data sets together to answer questions, I'm starting to become an archivist. And the archivists who I work with tell me that they feel that they're becoming historians. But they also tell me that a record only becomes a record when you attach a description to a document. And interestingly, when you think about what we do as historians, it's in the digital age that we do something very similar to that. So we take an image of a document, and then we transcribe it, and then we clean it, and then we add coding dictionaries to that, and we use those to code the transcript. And then what we've done in our case is hand that all back to the archive so that the archive can attach it back to the record. So what we've done is not just digitize the record, but we've made it more discoverable. We've provided the opportunity to provide more context into how it should be used and what are the pitfalls of usership. And you might call this enriching the provenance of the nation. It's also kind of handy because it gives us it gives us industry partners to work with. So it means that we've been able to use the linkage grant stream of ARC funding, which is much easier to acquire than discovery grants. Last couple of slides. I think it's really, really important to document data sets if you're going to do this. And maybe as a group of historians or a community, we should start to think about providing avenues to encourage that. Data documentation is really, really important. It's also very, very laborious. It's good to create incentives to encourage people to do this. And finally, in order to better organize data collection, we have created a not-for-profit organization called Digital History Tasmania. Now you'll see that our logo is deliberately designed so that you can knock Tasmania out and put something else in there. I don't know what that might be, but it would be lovely to see Western Australia. So thank you all very much, and I'm very happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Hamish. And with that, academic tenure, I think I need to work out which way to swipe, left or right, but I'll come and see you about that. Any questions of Hamish? So Hamish, I'm interested just and two questions actually. One was interesting that in your, I think, third slide where you had data on particular criminal activities, I guess, you included, I think, marriage licence in there as well. I was keen to understand how they got a Guernsey. And secondly, how did you find out who was literate and who wasn't?
Okay, so all convicts who wished to marry while under sentence had to apply for permission. And that register is really, really important for us because it provides enough variables to massively improve record linkage into marriage certificates. In fact, almost all women apply for permission to marry while they're under sentence. And since women are harder to follow post-sentence, that's a very important record group for us. Now, there's selection bias issues that we have to control for. But of course, one of the things that we want to know is which former convicts manage to marry and form families. And does family formation help in desistance? And of course, we're extraordinarily interested in what happens to the children of convict unions. In terms of literacy, every convict was asked whether they could read and write on arrival in Australia, starting from around about 1830.
Yeah, all of ours are.
Yeah, and so that data is very, very unusual for 19th century working class people. It's unusual to get systematic data on literacy for thousands of individuals, and also to have that data in conjunction with many, many other variables as well.
Hamish, I was very interested in the climate data you collected as part of this project, and I can understand it could be actually very useful for projects and understanding the impact of global warming and so forth over longer time periods. I'm just wondering what the link is with the understanding crime per se.
Well, again, our access into crime data, one of the things that we became really fascinated about with crime data was that it was a really, really good window on working class populations. And the great motivator for collecting daily weather temperatures was in fact to look at infant mortality in the 19th century. But it does have an impact on our ability to read convict records as well. So for example, convicts who worked outdoors were given time off during very wet weather. We've also found that convicts were more likely to be punished in the summer than they were in the winter. And I think this has got a lot to do with the length of the working day. The weather will affect all kinds of things. And so just being able to have daily weather data in a data set is incredibly valuable. I also say that because it was in the newspaper and printed, it was relatively easy to extract.
Hamish, thank you very much for that presentation. I certainly found it fascinating, and I'm sure everybody else did. We'll move now to John Hawkins. John, are you able to share your screen?
Okay, can you see that?
Can indeed, John. If you hit the from the beginning button, and I'll leave you to it.
Okay, so thank you very much for inviting Zach and I to present at the summit, David. So it's a shame can't be there in person, have to do this online, but if that's been live for the last year. And it does have one advantage in that I can be much cheekier and ruder about WA than I would be if I was actually in the room with you. So I'd like to first acknowledge the Ngunnawal people as traditional custodians of where I am, and also the traditional custodians of the Perth area. So if you would ask the average person which parts of Australia have been growing the fastest over the last 30 odd years, then I'm sure they'd mention the resource states. They'd say, well, there's been a mining boom, WA is obviously doing great, and Queensland slightly less so. But interestingly, when you look at the data, joining those two states as strong performers is the Australian Capital Territory, and it's even closer when you do the comparison on a per capita basis. The reason I chose this time period, I had hoped to go further back, but the National Library being shut made that harder to do. So this is what's available from the ABS website. But I cut it off in 1819 because I didn't want it to be contaminated by COVID. So I didn't want this to be a comparison of which state has handled COVID better, because I think that's sort of a separate issue to the more longer term issues that I wanted to look at. So this sort of made me interested in, well, what are the different things that explain the growth of WA and the ACT? Because if we look at another criterion for economic performance, has your state economy kept the unemployment rate low? We again see that, unsurprisingly, WA has done better than the Australian average, considerably better, but the ACT has done even better. So looking at labour productivity, always one of the key determinants of economic growth and per capita incomes. So in the starting point of my time period in 89-90, there wasn't that much difference across the country in the labour productivities of the various states. But this measure of gross state product, so the state equivalent of GDP per employed person, by the most recent year, WA had a clear lead over the rest of the country. It has clearly the fastest growth in labour productivity over this time period. But once again, the second highest growth rate's the ACT, and it's now the third highest labour productivity. So whatever WA is doing, the ACT is either doing something that's almost as effective or doing the same thing. So, but obviously WA and the ACT have vastly different economic structures. So about half of the ACT is Namadgi National Park. So in a geographic sense, Canberra is only about half the ACT, but there's virtually nobody who lives in Namadgi, and there's only a couple of small villages like Farwa and Hall. So from an economic viewpoint, the ACT essentially is the city of Canberra. In WA, it's also city-centric, but not as much. So 3/4 of the population live in Perth, but the regions contribute 40% or so of gross state product. Obviously, difference in the industrial structure. So ACT is essentially a white-collar workforce. Public administration is still the largest industry, but even though Canberra is still largely perceived as being a government town, that's public administration now less than a third of the economy. Obviously in WA, mining's the largest industry by a fair margin on value-added terms, but because it's such a capital-intensive industry, it's only the fourth largest industry if you do by employment. So here's the industry split in WA, and unsurprisingly, it's, mining by a huge margin is the largest, and construction is second largest, and that's also got a substantial component relating to the mining sector as well. ACT, again, unsurprisingly, public administration is the largest sort of industry. But it's the other industries that matter tend to be other service industries. So two very different economies. So then looked at, for each of these industrial sectors, what is labour productivity like in each sector? And one problem with this comparison is that there isn't any mining in the ACT, and that's the sector with the highest labour productivity. But one thing that sort of I found sort of interesting here was that the ACT has a lead over WA in terms of labour productivity in a lot of industries, and in particular service industries, and in particular sort of education, more high-tech type service industries. So you see that it's got high labour productivity in education, but it's got high productivity in the IT sort of sector, the information, media and telecommunications, where the labour productivity on average in the ACT is twice that in WA. Similarly, it's got a lead, albeit not a large lead, in professional, scientific, technical services, and also a big lead in public administration and even in real estate. So what does that suggest? Well, I mean, education is a larger part of the ACT economy than it is in the WA economy. ANU and University of Canberra have a bigger footprint in the ACT than the University of WA and Curtin and Murdoch have in West Australia. And that seems to be leading to some of these high-tech services clustering in the ACT and benefiting from an well-educated workforce and benefiting from links with the universities, and that seems to be the story of how the ACT is sort of almost matching WA overall, despite having the big hole of not having the holes in the ground. And we can see that sort of supporting that by looking at the education profile of the ACT compared to WA. WA is sort of around about the national average in terms of the proportion of the workforce with postgraduate degrees or with graduate diplomas or with bachelor degrees, whereas the ACT is well ahead on all of those criteria. So that's, I think, explaining how without a mining sector, the ACT is still sort of quite competitive. So there's a stream in the economic literature that talks about the resources curse, that having a lot of minerals can be bad. And it compares the performance over the period, say, since the Second World War, of a lot of countries that were very poor at the end of the Second World War, most of Africa, places like South Korea, Japan even. And then notes, though, that although a lot of those African countries were resource rich, they haven't grown anywhere near as fast as some of the economies that aren't particularly resource rich. I think South Korea, Singapore, and so on. So it's, in terms of explaining that, it's been suggested that having resources can be a problem because it encourages rent seeking, or it encourages countries not to train up and develop more sophisticated manufacturing and service industries. However, I don't think that's probably happened in WA, although there are some ways in which the mining industry has probably had an adverse impact on other parts of the WA economies. So, for example, I've heard stories that the tourism industry has got sort of crowded out, sort of literally by the mining industry, that the grey nomads that would have been travelling up the coast can't find any caravan parks to stay in because they're all full of fly-in, fly-out miners, that sort of thing. That tourist operators, it's hard to keep bus drivers or chefs because they can earn so much more working in the mining areas and so on. So there is some sort of crowding out. But the WA Inc. Period aside, I don't think there's been a sort of major sort of corruption and rent seeking that's sort of corrupted in that sense. There's another aspect of resource curse, though, that's sort of interesting, and that's the so-called Dutch disease, which, or Gregory effect, as it's sometimes called in Australia, which Max Corden and Bob Gregory, pictured here, two Australian economists, have been amongst the world leaders in describing. And the idea there is, it's called Dutch disease because after the Netherlands, when the discovery of North Sea oil led to a marked appreciation of the guilder, the Dutch currency, and that made their manufacturing services industries uncompetitive. So it's usually used in the context of comparing countries. And obviously in WA, we haven't had an appreciation of the WA dollar against the rest of the country because it's a common currency area. But WA is a big enough part of Australia's exports that the mining boom in WA led to an appreciation of the overall Australian dollar and affected the whole of the Australian economy. So that also would have had an adverse impact on some parts of WA, such as the tourism industry. But in net terms, clearly, I think the mining boom has still been a big net positive for the WA economy. For other parts of Australia, though, they also have had an appreciation, and that's hurt their export industries. So in the case of the ACT, the stronger Australian dollar makes it harder for us to attract international students to the universities. And as well as the fees that these students pay, they're also an important part of tourism in the ACT, because family and friends of those students will come to the ACT to visit them while they're there. So the Gregory effect hits the ACT economy. So that means it's in a sense even more impressive that the ACT economy has been able to perform as close to the WA economy as it had. So get an idea of how important mining is and how other aspects of the economy are performed, constructed a hypothetical ACT economy, which used for every industry its actual productivity, but then instead of weighting it by the actual employment shares in the ACT, weighted it with the industrial structure of WA. And productivity in this hypothetical economy not only grew faster than the actual ACT economy, but also faster than WA. So the conclusion I draw from that is that it's the fact that productivity growth in WA was higher than the ACT is entirely due to the mining boom, because on the other parts of the economy, the ACT has been outperforming. And that makes me wonder whether there is some sort of curse would be too strong a word, but resources of disadvantage evident in WA, that maybe having a mining sector has attracted talent away from other parts of the economy, and maybe it's a reason why productivity growth in the services sector has been weaker in WA than in places like the ACT. So that's the presentation, so happy to try to take some questions.
Thank you, John. Questions of John? guess one of the questions I had, John, in thinking all of that through, setting aside the fact that the ACT would need to have a lot of staff to be able to count all the tax that comes from WA into your coffers. And just building on your fact that we're thousands of miles apart. But the other thing is the productivity calculation itself still a relevant calculation in the context of, say, comparing mining to an economy like the ACT?
I think it does. It is relevant to income. So the fact that you've not only had a mining boom in the sense of the quantities that you've been mining, but also a mining boom in terms of the prices. I think that has driven the high incomes in WA and presumably fed through into other parts of the WA economy.
Any other questions? There's no hands up. I'm going to take the next one then. I'm really intrigued with the differentiation between education in WA and education in ACT as well, given the size of the WA market and the universities and so on. I'm just wondering if you've got any further comments on productivity or other elements that you think might be relevant to that.
Well, maybe in WA, the sort of message that bright Year 12 students get is that the way to make money is to move into the mining industry rather than get a lot of tertiary education, or you get your geology degree or your engineering degree, and then you go and work for a mining company rather than then going on to do a master's degree or a PhD. Whereas in Canberra, maybe the good students are more likely to get more education.
Yeah. Rico.
I have a question about your, I'm not sure exactly what you call it, but the counterfactual model you come up with. Could you test it in reverse and put the weights of the ACT economy into the Western Australian productivity numbers as sort of a robustness check, see if the story makes sense?
Yeah, I did that, but that of course means that the mining industry gets discarded because it gets the ACT weight of 0, and then the WA economy grows much slower than the real WA economy.
Okay, so it tells exactly the same story.
Yeah.
In terms of what you were talking about with, I guess, the resources curves that you'd nicknamed, it does sound largely correlational. So I wonder if you wanted to establish if there was some sort of causation or not, how would you go about doing that?
I need a much larger sample than 2 states.
Okay.
Yeah, the model, the counterfactual model that you mentioned, have you looked at that from the perspective of, say, pre-West Australian gold rush, say a colonial history model when the mining and the industrial development was in, admittedly pre-Canberra, was in the southeast of Australia, and whether the conclusions would turn out to be similar?
Yeah, it would be interesting to look at other sort of historical periods, and that is something I would like to do once I've got access to the National Library and even my own office for that, at the university for that matter, which I don't at the moment due to lockdown. So I was sort of restrained in this paper to using what I could get from the internet. But yeah, I agree that would make it a much richer paper.
Well, thank you very much again. We appreciate the paper. Cheers.
Thank you. Thank you.
Folks, we've got a brief break now, and then when we come back, we'll have 2 recorded presentations from our colleagues in England and a third presentation from Abel in Denmark. So please grab a coffee, go and have a smoke or whatever it is you do with a break. Yeah, off campus. So go over that side of the road if you're choosing to do that, and we'll see you shortly. Thank you.